Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton. This week we are going to get into red flags in relationships. And these are red flags that are mainly you're going to want to look for during the dating period. So
Yes.
if you're married, it's a little bit too late, but these are red flags that you don't want to ignore. And it's going to be important to start out with a caveat that just because somebody has one of these things doesn't necessarily mean that it's a red flag in and of itself.
Well, the way I interpret that is it's something you ought to pay attention to. I think the
Yeah.
way I would frame it is it doesn't necessarily mean you end the relationship. I
Yes,
think what it means is that it's important to have a dialogue about it
I
and
like that.
be able to talk about it and express your concerns and, if there's a solution or change in behavior. So none of these necessarily mean that you end the relationship. Some might actually when we get
Yeah.
through them. But yeah, I think that the important thing in relationships and we talk about this on the radio show a lot, people tend to ignore them. I think the reason is, early on in a relationship, you're falling in love and there's a lot of physical attraction. And I mean, typically if you're single, you don't have kids yet. And so you have a lot of time to spend together.
Mm-hmm.
And you might be aware of one of these red flags and you think, oh, that won't be a problem. Or,
Right.
the feelings that you've got are so strong right now because it's the start of the relationship. But what I say to couples often is that some things are not a problem until you have children.
Yep.
And maybe you're in a relationship, but that you don't want to have children, which is
Mm-hmm.
fine. I'm not saying that everyone has to have children. It's just, the vast majority of couples are planning a family. And so that's what I would suggest you think about. Can I be a parent with this other person when they're doing this thing? I think that's one of the things that you need to consider. So don't ignore the red flags.
Yeah.
If it's a big red flag, maybe you do end the relationship, but at least
Yes.
talk about it.
And we'll let you know, because I was reading this list and I was like, oh yeah, there's a couple of these where I would turn tail and run. I mean, it would be an
Yeah,
immediate end of the relationship for
right.
me, or at least it would have been. But I really like the way you put it, that it warrants a dialogue, because some of these, it's like, well, there could be a reason, there could be an underlying cause. And so let's start with a really good one that's complicated, that
Okay.
definitely, and I think you mentioned in here, relationships with families of origin.
Oh, yeah.
So that is very important in a relationship, because we all know that when you marry someone, you're marrying into their family and you
Right.
cannot escape that.
No.
And in most cases, nor should you. And so especially, and you said especially their parents and how do they treat their parents.
Mhm.
Now, that warrants a conversation, because I mean, not all parents are great parents. I mean, we know that there are parents who are manipulative, who are abusive, and sometimes it's very warranted for people to keep their parents at an arm's length. And so that's not necessarily a red flag if there's that kind of relationship.
Right. And so I agree with you, that sometimes there's a great book. It's an old book called Toxic Parents, which is actually a very good book. But see, if you have a troubled relationship with your parents, I would say you create that distance. It doesn't mean that you treat them poorly. Like if you're with them and you're treating them poorly, I still think that's a red flag, even if the parents are problematic. See, I
Mm-hmm.
would say the
Okay.
healthier thing to do would be, to create some distance. If you
Yeah.
need distance from the parents, don't treat them poorly. That's not good for you. It's not good for them. And again, it goes to children. I mean, if you think about this, let's say you have children and they become grandparents. You
Mm-hmm.
don't want your kids seeing you treat their grandparents that way. And
Yes.
I think grandparents are really important in kids' life, but I think it's better to have distance rather than treat them poorly. So
Mm-hmm.
I think you pay attention to, are they respectful? Are they kind? I think the respect is really important. But again, we both realize that there are parents that it's hard to show
Yes.
respect to. And
Mm-hmm.
so if that's the case, then I think you figure out a way so that you don't have to be around them that often. I'm a real
Yeah.
advocate for for creating boundaries. We've talked about,
Yeah.
boundaries in parents with families of origin before, and I think that it doesn't necessarily mean you don't have get to be around those parents. I think you just create the boundaries. But that very first thing, you're going to be around once you meet the other person's parents. Pay attention to what's going on.
Mhm.
And I think, I probably should have put this one down. Pay attention to how the parents treat your partner.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
think that's important too.
Yeah.
And I would say that doesn't mean you break off the relationship. I just think you have to have a dialogue about it because looking down the road, what does that look like? Let's say the relationship gets stronger, you get married, you end up having kids, and 20 years from now, those parents are treating their child very poorly.
Yeah.
That becomes problematic. And I think if you talk about it early on, then
Mhm.
it's easier to deal with.
Yes, you found someone that you like, you're interested in, you want to pursue the relationship. You need to pay attention to these things before
Right.
you make that commitment.
So I think the takeaway on this one is just pay attention to what I call it family of origin relationships
Yeah.
are they're important and they can be very enlightening. And you
Mhm.
have to think of it, or at least I'm suggesting strongly, you think of it in terms of the future.
Yeah. And speaking of this for myself, Curtis had a rather troubled childhood, and his mom, she did the best she could given the circumstances, and she'll admit that she made some poor choices, particularly in marrying some people that she did, and I really admired the fact that he still loved and respected his mother, and that was something that was important to me. And I think one of the reasons that you pay attention to the way your spouse treats their parents is because eventually that's the way they're going to treat you.
That's true. They're very similar. Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. I mean, because when you're first in love and, and it's exciting and it's new, they're putting their best foot forward. It's like you're trying to sell yourself, right? And
Yeah.
so, you're,
Right. You are.
yeah. So, you're treating each other with all this love and kindness and you think, oh man, they'd never treat me that way. Well, I'm telling you, 10, 15 years down the road,
Yeah.
they're going to be just as familiar and comfortable with you as they are with their parents.
Right.
And it's going to happen. All right, let's talk about anger or outbursts. So, anger. Now, anger in and of itself doesn't necessarily make it a red flag because anger is a valid emotion and it's
Right.
okay to be angry. It's
Right.
that uncontrolled anger that
Right.
is a red flag.
Or what I'd call explosive anger. And
Yeah.
one of the ways I describe it to couples is flood. You're flooding. Physiologically, you're flooding, and it causes you to react in a very big way. And so I think you have to pay attention to that and pay
Yeah.
attention to the context in which it happens. Does it
Yes.
happen with, family again? Does it happen with you as a
Mhm.
potential partner? Does it happen with friends? And that can be really problematic because that
Mhm.
and often is hard to change. Now, again, I think if you have the dialogue and the person who has that uncontrolled anger realizes it, I think they have to really have a plan on how they learn to control it, which could be therapy. I certainly don't think taking drugs, medication is a way to go on that.
Mhm.
Meditation and exercise, all those things that we've talked about.
Yeah.
And you have to figure out what's going on when that person floods and then has that explosive anger. Don't
Mhm.
ignore that.
Yes, definitely. And everyone has a limit, right? I mean, we've
Mhm.
all experienced regret or done and said things in anger that we regret. That's very natural and a very human emotion. But how often does that happen? That's something that you don't ignore, and it's worth a conversation.
Right. And I think the final thing I'll say on this is there is a very big physiological component
Yeah.
to that uncontrolled anger. And often people don't realize that. And the only way you solve that is to figure out what's going on physiologically and then work on
Mhm.
that as
Yeah.
well. That's why I call it the flooding, because usually there's something going on where physiologically they're flooding.
Yeah. All right. Having no friends. And now this is one of those ones that it's like, I don't know that it necessarily means ending the relationship, but it's something to look at because there's all sorts of reasons for people not having, I guess, maybe a lot of friends, right? I mean, some people
Mhm.
are just antisocial And if you're okay with that, then okay, or maybe both of you kind of tend to be antisocial and have no friends. But if you're a really outgoing person and this person has no friends, that might be a problem.
So I need to make a statement about the word antisocial. From a psychological perspective, we think of that in a very different way.
That's
So,
true.
I would call them maybe introverts.
Yeah.
Antisocial for us is actually someone who doesn't follow social norms. It's not necessarily that they don't have friends. Antisocial personality disorder, for instance, is someone who, like a sociopath, would. I
Yes.
mean, that's another term. So I just don't want people to be confused who are listening. So we use antisocial in a very different way. I would call them introverts,
Yeah.
probably. Here's the reason to be aware of it. And again, as I'm looking at this list, a lot of this has to do with what happens 10 years down the road. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm actually dealing with a couple right now where one of the partners does not have friends. And so what happens is they're totally dependent on the other person for any type of
Mm.
connection. And that gets to be really, really tough for
Yeah.
that person because they're fulfilling all their partner's needs. And it can be exhausting. And the person who's doing that said they will use the term, I feel smothered.
Yeah.
And so
Okay.
I think that you have to think about what would that be like 10 years down the road if you're the only outlet
Mm-hmm.
for that person. And so again, a dialogue is important to, you know, get to the idea, well, what is going on that you don't have many friends? Is it that
Yeah.
you're an introvert? And then the other part of that would be, especially if one of you is more social and the other is more of an introvert, then if I want to go out and have fun, am I going to have to do that alone? Or are
Mm-hmm.
you going to come out? Will you be uncomfortable? That happens all the time where you have
Yep.
an extrovert and an introvert that get married. And again, I'm Lindy's more of an extrovert than I am. And I'm a real introvert, but I can go out and socialize and be fine. But again, you have to look beyond what's happening right now and
Mm-hmm.
anticipate what the future might look like.
Yes. And so you and Lindy sound a lot like Curtis and I, where he's definitely more introverted, but he can go out and socialize. And I think another important thing, at least in our relationship, is he understands that I am an extrovert and that I need that social interaction. And so he doesn't hold me back. That's important in a relationship. And that's important to talk about early on because if I want to go out and have fun with my friends, he very much encourages that. He says, yeah, go have lunch with your friends, go be social. I'm content to just sit here and play video games. And that
But
works great for us.
right. And I've seen couples, though, where that person isn't happy when the other one goes out. They try and hold them back. And see, that's part of what I'm meaning, anticipate what the future looks like, because
Yeah.
I think the way you do that is great. Go out, have fun.
Hmm.
But that doesn't always happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And
And
so
that can be
it's,
problematic.
yeah. And so I think it's worth a dialogue and it's worth thinking I like you said into the future because when you're so in love and in the beginning of that relationship you only want to spend all your time together anyways.
Right.
And I don't know, maybe Curtis might have felt a little smothered in the beginning of our relationship because I just wanted to spend all my time with him because I was
Yeah.
just so in love with him. But I like other people too, not as much as him, but I do like other people.
Uh,
All right. So this one I would consider an instant red flag, turn tail and run. And that is not
okay.
kind, that's not kind to others, like wait staff in restaurants. And when I read this, I'm like, oh, okay, I've heard of someone like this. Someone who is belittling, like, oh, they're beneath my station. That is a major red flag because that is very pompous and arrogant. And that
Yeah.
does not sound like something you want to be married to.
Right. I don't know that I'd necessarily turn and run, but I'd sure address it and say, I don't like this behavior. Can you change it? I mean, I
Okay.
probably use
Yeah.
different words than that, but
Mm-hmm.
essentially that's what you're after because the person who's being that way, rude or condescending to wait staff or other people,
Yeah.
they may not even realize what they're doing.
Okay.
But I think it's important to talk about it. And if, you're going to get some people who say, well, that's just the way I am. If you ever hear that, that's
Yeah.
just the way I am. I didn't write that down, but that's a big red flag because
Yeah.
what they're essentially saying is, I'm not going to change and I don't really
Yep.
need to change.
Yep.
And I really think that marriage is I, I think it's about changing. I
It
think we
is.
are dynamic through the lifespan.
Yeah.
And Lindy and I often talk about how 45 years ago we're very different people now
Oh yeah.
than we were 45 years ago. And one of the things that makes it work is that we've changed together and accepted the
Hmm.
changes
Yeah.
in each other. And so I think people can change, but if you ever hear, nah, it's just the way I am, that's a huge red flag. I probably would run on that one.
Yeah. Yep. All right. So this one, I am gonna say another turn tail and run, and that is not kind to pets.
And I probably agree with you on that.
Yeah.
And people probably realize that it's one of the things you look at in young children and adolescents. It's a real
Hmm.
marker for, I'll use the word disturbed behavior.
Yeah.
And so if you then have an adult who does that, I think I'd probably leave too. I'd probably
Yeah.
say that. That is absolutely not a good sign.
No, it's really not. And I want to differentiate between being unkind to pets and not caring for pets.
Not, you may not be a pet person. That's not what
Yes.
we're talking about, but
Yes, because
being mean or kicking or hitting or
yeah.
being abusive to pets, to small animals, that's really what we're talking about.
All right. So controlling behavior often goes with lack of trust issues or anxiety.
So if a person is anxious, and
Yes.
I've probably talked about this before, that in many couples that I see, one or both might be anxious. And anxiety, in extreme forms is difficult to live with.
Mm-hmm.
Because it does that, one of the things that we do when we're anxious is we try and control our environment. And we
Yes.
have to have things a certain way. And so I think if you're with someone who tends to be controlling, I think there's almost always an underlying issue that's
Mm-hmm.
going with that. Now, it often goes with lack of trust as well. And
Yeah.
so, for instance, if you've been in a relationship before and say you've been cheated on or betrayed in some way in a previous relationship, then it's often the case that in your current relationship, you may not be as trusting. Again, I think it's anxiety. Your anxiety is the other person going to, cheat on me like the other one
Yeah.
did. Then I think it becomes controlling. Like, so when I'm talking about controlling, it's like, I want to know where you are all the time. I want you to call me all the time. I want,
Yep.
checking in. And that's one of those that I think you really need to address. And I
Mm-hmm.
would even go so far as to say you need to start getting help with it. So
Yeah.
again, I don't know that it's a break off the relationship.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things that if it's not treated,
Mm-hmm.
if it's left uncontrolled, then again, 5 years in, it's very problematic because
Right.
you get tired of being saying, "Where are you? When are you coming home?
Yep.
Who did you go to lunch with?" That type of thing. Because
Mm-hmm.
either you're anxious or you're distrustful.
Yeah. And that can very much stem from families of origin. So
Yeah.
right? I mean, and they don't have to be break off the relationship, but it's just something to be aware of. And maybe the controlling behavior is something you can live with. Like I'm thinking of people who have obsessive compulsive disorder or who just really like things neat. And a lot of times people who are very anxious because they can control their environment and having a clean house often calms their anxiety or it makes them very anxious to have an untidy environment. And so, again, that's a control thing, but it's something that is very easily to live with as long as you're okay living with it.
Right. And I still think for a lot of people, it gets to be difficult in the long
Okay.
term.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I've seen it. I
Yeah.
mean, I think you're right. There are probably some people who can live with that, but I've certainly seen it where couples come in and, this guy's cleaning all the time and, it's fine for the first 10 years. And after that, it becomes problematic. You get tired of it. You wear out. And,
Okay.
and so you wear out of having to, always put the thing back in the exact same place or check the lock on the door 3 times before you come to bed.
Hmm.
But again, I want to emphasize that these particular issues like that can be treated.
Yeah.
And it's just if the person who has those particular issues is willing to recognize it
Hmm.
and then willing to do something about it and seek some treatment. Because I think you can, I don't know that you'd ever take it away completely, but you can
Yeah.
certainly diminish it to the point where it would be tolerable.
Yeah.
And So again, having the dialogue before, talking about it before, don't just think I can live with this
Yeah.
because in all likelihood you probably won't be able to long term after years.
Yeah. Yes. All right. So, issues with substance abuse or dependence. This is one I would really, really not ignore. I mean, I would say it borderlines on turn, tail, and run, but it can be iffy
Yeah,
because, I mean, it depends on the substance abuse and the dependence, right? But I mean, that is a major red flag that you do not ignore.
right. And so I want to be clear, like if someone is in recovery and so
Hmm.
they were, say, using a substance, again, that's a good thing. And
Yes.
that doesn't mean you break off the relationship. It's just, here's the one that's common nowadays. And it's a little bit concerning because certainly cannabis is legal in, I don't know how many states, certainly a
A
lot of
lot.
states.
Yeah.
And often I'll see young couples and they're using cannabis. And when they're single, it's probably fine. And, one might be using it and the other might not. It's, as I said earlier, when it changes is
Yes.
when you have children.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so, but, any substance use, here's the other thing to remember, and I think this is true for any substance, is that it alters your emotional state.
Hmm.
And so you become someone different.
Yeah.
And you have to decide, do you want to be with that person when they're using that substance? And
Hmm.
in some ways, it takes you out of the current relationship. It's like you can't be truly emotionally intimate in
Yeah.
that moment. And so, as the partner, as the non-using partner, are you okay having the other person check out every once?
Hmm.
Now, most people aren't.
Yeah.
And so that's why you need to address this, and it's a big red flag. Yeah,
Well,
alcohol use can be the same thing.
yeah.
If you're binge drinking, like and again, it's not can you have a drink, every so often, or a glass of wine at night? That's not the problem.
Yeah.
It's are you binge drinking? Are you getting drunk? Are you drinking enough every night that you're checking out?
Yeah.
That you become a little bit drunk, not entirely. It changes who you are.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, because there are many, many people who enjoy social drinking
Right.
or who enjoy a glass of wine. That's not a problem. And I even recreational cannabis use. Like some people, they
Right.
enjoy that kind of thing recreational. And that's not necessarily a problem. It's when it's repeated, right? And so, and it's one of those things that you talk about early on in the relationship. How often do you like to drink? How often do you like to do drugs? Like that's good to know early on
Yeah.
because if they say, "Oh yeah, I like to do it all the time." Okay, well, what about when you have kids, right?
Yeah.
Again, because like you said, it's when you have kids it changes.
Right. And how do you have that emotional connection if you're high
Yeah.
most of the time?
Yep.
So, yeah, I agree with you. And here's one of the ways that I think you can tell, because I've heard people talk about it this way. They look back and they say that the substance use, whatever it was, made them feel uncomfortable.
Mm.
And so
Okay.
you're going to have this internal realization of either I'm uncomfortable or something doesn't feel quite right. Pay attention to that. Do
Yeah.
not ignore that. Pay attention.
Yes. All right. So this next one, oh, it's probably really common. Excessive amount of time on social media. That is a red flag to be sure, but it's so common these days because social media is so addicting.
It is. So there's a new book out. I don't think I mentioned it. It's called The Chaos Machine.
Okay.
And the premise behind the book is, and I think I've talked about AI, so that artificial intelligence and the way they use it in social media. Its goal is to hook you and to keep you on the phone or the tablet and to keep you
Mm,
scrolling and to keep you clicking.
yeah.
That is the goal
Yep.
because in the end, they make more money through advertising or, whatever it is. So it's all about money. It acts just like a drug, and you ought to consider that it is a drug
Hmm.
because people are addicted to it, just like you said. And so I hear this often. He or she is always on their phone. He or she is always on social media. And
Yeah.
I had a new couple client on Thursday. That's what it was. So I think you can change that.
Yeah.
I think it's an addiction that can easily be changed, but often the person doesn't want to.
Yeah.
And so again, over time, you're going to get tired of it because you aren't as important to that person as their social media is.
Yeah. And another thing to keep in mind is because I know many people who social media is their platform that they run their business on. That is very, very common. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem, but are you okay with that? Because oftentimes when someone is running a business on social media, they have to put a lot of time in it. Maybe not an excessive amount of time, but they do have to invest time. They have to look presentable for the camera. They have to advertise their product or their services, whatever they're selling. It's one of those things, it's an important dialogue to have early on in the relationship.
Right. And I've certainly run into couples where that's the case. And here's what
Yeah.
I would say about that. And this is actually true about, in COVID, where a lot of people are working at home. There's not a very good delineation between work and home. And
Yes.
so, again, if you need that social media for your work, which is true for many, many businesses, I
Yes.
think you need to have an end to it.
Yeah.
Meaning, you're working, whether it's 8 to 5, whatever it is, but at some point in the evening, you're done.
It's a boundary. You've got to
It's
have
a
a
boundary.
boundary.
So
Yep.
it's not that you don't do it, if it's important to your business. It's just you have to be able to turn that off. And
Yeah.
part of the problem with social media, it's very difficult to turn it off
Yep.
because then, you end work at 5 or whenever it is, and then you're focused on your partner. And
Yeah.
that's really all the partner typically wants. It's not necessarily the social media itself,
Mm-hmm.
it's the lack of focus on the other person that
Yes.
becomes the problem.
Where are you investing your time?
Yeah. Yeah.
That
And so,
matters.
yeah, and if it's during the workday, fine.
Yeah.
Fine. Well, that's great. But you have to end it. And the
Yeah.
problem is usually all this stuff is on our phones, and we typically have our phones with us all the time. So
Yep.
it's really easy. So it's just about setting the boundary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. This one I am also going to say is another turn tail and run. Any type
I would
of
agree with you on that. I
yeah,
think that's true.
any type of abusive behavior, physical, emotional, or verbal. It's not okay. And don't let someone be a project. Don't think, oh, I'm going to be the one to save this person and to be able to get them to stop their abuse. If there's abuse going on, I think you just need to say, if we're going to ever consider a serious relationship, you have to deal with this problem first. I can't be involved with this because abuse is just not a road you want to go down.
Right. I wouldn't put up with it. I mean, I think it's pretty simple to
Yeah.
say that any type of abusive behavior.
Yes. Yep. That one's pretty quick. So this one, oof. Oh, this one is another borderline one. Self-centered, has trouble with empathy. That would be an ender in my book. Like I couldn't deal with that.
I didn't use the word narcissistic, but it's
Yeah.
a little bit narcissistic. And the problem is that the relationship is not reciprocal, doesn't feel
Yeah.
reciprocal.
Yep.
And I think that's what you want over time is you want to have it be it's never really equal, but caring for each other,
Yes.
doing things for each other. But if it's just one, because what that is, being self-centered, having trouble with empathy is pretty one-sided.
Yeah.
And that gets old pretty fast.
No
So
one
no
likes
matter
ego.
how much you are attracted to or love that person, because
Yeah.
often those people can be very engaging
Yep.
and pretty charismatic.
Yeah.
It's just not worth it.
Yeah, I knew someone like that I worked with. They were so friendly and they were open and they were outgoing and like they were just so inviting and they talked to you and then you get to know them and it's like, "Oh wow,
Yeah.
this person doesn't listen to anybody or anything anyone else says and they always have to do things their way."
Yeah.
That's a problem. I mean, it
It
may not
is.
seem like one now, but it will be. I
Well,
guarantee.
it is definitely a problem. And, the issue is you fall in love and you think, oh, I really want to be with this person. And they have this really hard trait or behavior. It's not going to change. That
No.
particular one is just not going to change.
Yep. All right. So this last one is another iffy one, but it is a red flag and you don't ignore it. Does not take care of themselves physically or emotionally. And you kind of paired this with sleep issues.
Yeah.
Now, sleep issues are pretty common in today's day and age. And a sleep issue in and of itself is not a red flag. I mean, it warrants a conversation, but it's not. I mean, I guess it depends on how long the sleep issue has been going on. If it's a chronic sleep issue and they're aware of it and they're dealing with it, hey, kudos to them.
Right. The dealing with it is the key there, though.
Yeah. Yes.
See, a lot of
Yeah.
people don't deal with the sleep issues, and I think that lack of sleep makes everything harder.
Yes.
You don't have the emotional reserves that you might need when in the relationship you need some good emotional reserves because all relationships are going to get bumpy.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, as I've mentioned before, let's say you have children and you have that lot, I mean, you're going to have natural lack of sleep anyway, but if it's a
Yes.
chronic lack of sleep, then that becomes a problem. But I want to echo something you said. That it doesn't necessarily mean that you end the relationship, but I think you have to deal with it.
Yes.
Not taking care of self physically. I mean, that could be, you know, showering, it's
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
basic hygiene things. Don't
Yes.
let that go. Or exercise. It can be, not getting enough exercise. Not taking care of oneself emotionally, I
Mm-hmm.
think is, again, self-care is important. Do you take time out for yourself? Do you go on walks? Things like that, just taking care of yourself emotionally. Sometimes I'll see people, they have a job and they're
Mm-hmm.
so invested in the job and they're just working all the time. See, I would say they aren't taking care of themselves physically or
Yeah.
emotionally if you're a workaholic. And so that's an example of what we're talking about is you need downtime.
Yeah. You
You need
need,
downtime physically and emotionally
yeah.
because after a while, it just gets to be too hard.
It comes down to balance. Is
I
this
like that.
person, yeah, is this person balanced? I mean, because we all get busy and life gets hectic.
I really like that. That's a good way
Yeah.
to end the episode is
Yeah.
that for couples and for individuals, I think there is a tendency in our culture today to get our life out of balance.
Yeah.
And it's really important to be balanced in work. I think it's important to work. It's important to take downtime. It's important to have alone time. It's
Mm-hmm.
important to have friend time and couple time. And
Yeah.
I don't like the term balance. That's what you're after.
Yeah. And so these are red flags that you don't ignore, but I don't want people to walk away from this episode thinking, because is there a good person anywhere? And so, I mean, you have to remember we are people, not unicorns. And so, like,
Okay.
no one's perfect.
Right.
we all
No one's
have,
perfect.
yeah, we all have flaws and we all have things in life that we're going to have to work on.
And I think maybe the theme that has emerged is for most of these, have a dialogue about them.
Yeah.
Start talking about them. Don't wait until you're married to have the dialogue. Talk
Yes.
about it
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
And then a lot of these issues can be dealt with and
Mm-hmm.
can be treated. So don't wait 5 years to then say, hey, this has been a problem for 5 years. Deal with it before. So I like that. It's mostly about addressing it.
Yeah.
Don't ignore it, address it.
Yeah. For most of these, some of them,
Most of it. The abuse
yeah.
one, I agree with you. Just
Yeah.
don't deal
And
with it.
not kind to pets falls very much under that abuse. If you're
Right.
abusive to a pet, I mean, again, just
Yeah.
end it. Just walk away flat out. All right. Next week, we're going to get into a good topic. So, we're going to talk about manipulation, which is something we haven't talked about before, but it's going to be interesting. And I think it's going to create a little bit of a philosophical dialogue.
Hmm.
So,
Hope
stay tuned
so.
for that. Yeah, it'll be good.
Have a good week, everyone.
See everyone next week. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.